I think we're ready to start. Kurt got the wine open, so we're ready to go now.
Let's go, party on!
All right. For those that don't know me, I'm Steve Sowers. I'm the president of the Historical Society this year. I want to thank you all for coming out. This is going to be a fun night. I know there's a lot of family here. Soapbox Derby, I never got involved in it because I wanted something with a motor in it. You know, even at 12, I wanted to drive. I was driving tractors. So, yeah, I'm sure you were in Nebraska. But we're honored tonight to have Marlin Clark here with us. That's his race car sitting on the table back there next to Mr. B that he raced in 1948, 73 years ago. He also built the car, if I'm correct.
Right, correct.
I think that's part of the rules. So, to get me out of here, I'm going to introduce Marlin Clark and have him come up, and we're just going to get going.
Good evening. All-American Soapbox Derby was a downhill race, unpowered, of cars that were built exclusively by the driver, with two minor exceptions. Well, I shouldn't say minor, two exceptions. One, the wheels and axles were purchased from the organization, and two, those elements associated with the steering, you could have help from an adult to do things like welding or things like that. Other than that, it was 100% to be done by the boy who was going to drive the car. Some of the basic rules: 80 inches long, 36 inches wide, 150 pounds maximum for the car, 250 pounds maximum for the car and boy together. Because of the limit on the car weight, I went in with a 20-pound disadvantage because I only weighed 80 pounds at that time. I was 12 when I built that car in 48, 11 when I built the one the year before. The year before I won the local race. I came in second at the local race. In 1948, I won the local race and went back to Akron, Ohio for the Nationals. The age range for the boys was between 11 and 15. And 11 and 12-year-olds raced in the B class, which raced separately in the local races, and then the A class, which was 13 through 15, and you got the winners of those two, and then they raced against each other to determine the local winner. First national race was in 1934. There were no races held from 42 to 45 because of World War II. So it was the second year after they resumed after World War II that I built my first car, and the third year when this one was built. Just to give you an idea, the sponsors were Chevrolet, national sponsors were Chevrolet Motor Company, and the local newspaper from each city that had a local race. That's why you see on the side of that it says Sydney Telegraph. That was the local newspaper for Sydney, Nebraska, which is where I raced in the local race. Before I won that race, and before that was ready to go back to Akron, they took off my original sponsor, which was the Oliver implement dealer that my uncle owned in Chapel. So they removed all those decals and had to put the Sydney Telegraph decal on. Give you an idea of some of the prizes. First prize at the Nationals was a 4-year scholarship to any university in the United States. Wow. Second prize was a Chevrolet sedan. Third prize, and this gives you an idea now, because this is something that in today's market isn't worth much, but in 1948 was a lot. A 16 millimeter portable motion picture projector and film for the races, of the races. Now that was a big deal then. Now, you know, not so much now. Fourth prize was a radio phonograph combination. Again, big deal in 48, not so much now. Fifth prize, a 4x5 speed graphic camera. Now that's what the professionals used in that time. 4 inch by 5 inch film, speed graphic was the top of the line. And each local champion received a Bulova sweep hand wristwatch. So that was the list of prizes, among lots of other things. I mean, things when we were back there, just all kinds of stuff. I built 2 cars, like I said, 47, 48. The first one in 47 was July 17th, and that was so that you could have the local race, so that you could have the national races later in August. And August 15th, in fact, in 1948 was when the nationals was. My first race was in Sidney, Nebraska, the local races, and the nationals were held in Akron, Ohio. My entry into the soapbox derby was relatively natural. I was born on a farm, a wheat farm in western Nebraska, dryland wheat. I don't remember learning how to drive. I always did. When I was 3, maybe 4 at the outside, I can remember we were out drilling wheat. I was with my dad, which I always was. And we were a mile from home, and we had a big truck and a tractor with the drills behind it, and we had 2 drivers, Dad, myself. So I stood up on the seat. Dad started the truck, hand throttle, pulled it down a little bit, put it in extra low, jumped out of the truck when it got going, and I drove it home. When I got to where I had to turn, I just turned it off. So, like I say, I don't remember learning how to drive. By the time I was 8, I was driving the tractor full-time in the field. We didn't have any hydraulics on the steering or even, getting the implements in and out of ground. It was a big lever and you shook on it, and at, 50 pounds or so, you kind of had to jump or thing to get things out of the ground. But that was my childhood. If I wasn't sleeping or eating or going to school, I was with my dad. That's just kind of the way it was. And so after I was maybe 11, I guess, anytime we went someplace in the pickup, I drove the pickup too. Which, when I went to get my first driver's license, which was at the age of 14, because at that time, if you were in the country, you could get a school permit to drive to and from school by the most convenient method, or direction, or path, I guess that's what I'm trying to say. Now, once I got out of the driveway, sometimes I got confused about what roads I was allowed to drive on. So when I finally got my, I also got a learner's permit at age 15 and a half, because that gave me a little more legal flexibility. So when I got my driver's license at age 16, they never did give me a driver's test. My dad said, it's, well, the Highway Patrol have seen you driving all the time anyhow, so they didn't need to give you a test. I built the car in my dad's shop. In 1946, I guess, we built a big machine shed on the farm, and that Dad had a big shop because we repaired all our own equipment, whether it meant overhauling the tractor or building a new trailer, putting it together, welding it, and all that stuff. And he had a pretty good shop, pretty good tools. So that's where it was built. And as I mentioned before, it had to be built by the individual who was going to drive the car. Because we had built that shed, and it was 48 by 60, so it was a good sized shed, and it was built with what they called Rilco rafters. They were wooden rafters, not unlike, if any of you have been in the hangars and seen the wooden rafters in there, similar to that, except they had a little bit of a peak at the top. And they're all laminated wood, just like the ones down there. And the way they were packed and shipped, there were 1 inch square pieces of wood that were packed all around them to keep them from getting damaged and so forth. That, if you look closely, you can see that as you go up the side of that car, there's about 1-inch increments. The car was built by laying down a wooden platform of which there's provisions for the axles to attach permanently in the back and on a kingpin in the front. And then those 1-inch square pieces were bent around to follow the curve, pointed in the front and back, and then glued and screwed to each other, you know, originally to the base and then working its way up. And then pieces of oak that were shaped to fit it and glued together to make the top, both front and back. As I mentioned, the axles, which are metal square, about 3/4 inch square, I put wood fairing basically over them to, you know, reduce the drag, because that's what it's all about. I mean, theoretically, for those that are physicists, it makes no difference what something weighs. If you drop it in a vacuum, it gets to the floor at the same time, right? Follows the acceleration of gravity. However, that's not real life. In real life, you have air, which creates friction on the body of the car, and you have wheels which are rotating and bearings in them, so there's friction in that aspect. So the more the car weighs, the less the air drag and the friction in the wheels affect the total speed that you're going to accumulate. So being 20 pounds light was definitely a hazard on it. And you're not allowed to add weight to the car beyond what is built in for the function of building the car. So I was a little light on the car as well. The ideal situation would have been to take a solid log, hollow out just what you needed to crawl in of it, and then shape the outside. Then you've got everything filled with wood and you can get maximum weight out of it. As I mentioned before, I spent all my time that I can remember with my dad. One exception would be when I was about 7, I guess. He would be out in the field working during the day. I would go out at lunchtime and relieve him at lunch and drive the tractor for an hour, you know, while he came in at 8. And then by the time I was 8, we swapped, and I was doing the full day, and he was doing the lunchtime relief. But the experience back there at Akron was amazing. We took the train back, and the organization paid for my and my folks' trip back, as well as their stay in Akron, and I stayed the boys all stayed out on a YMCA camp. It was an amazing camp. It was like nothing I'd ever seen, you know, being from a small town in western Nebraska. And some of you that looked at the pictures and stuff, each of the cabins had names on them. The name of the cabin that I stayed in was Jimmy Stewart. And so one of the pictures I have here is a picture of all the kids in the cabin and Jimmy Stewart, which meant absolutely nothing to me at the time. I didn't know who Jimmy Stewart was. Didn't mean anything to me. When I looked at it, you know, 30 years later, I said, oh, heaven's sakes, yeah, I was standing there within 3 or 4 feet of Jimmy Stewart. Didn't have a clue. One of the highlights for me was on the way back, we stopped in Chicago. That was kind of like halfway, and we spent the night and actually spent a day in Chicago. And we went to the Museum of Science and Industry. And this was the most amazing thing as a 12-year-old boy that I had ever seen. There was all kinds of things like they had this big rack, and hanging from the top bar were 5 steel balls about this big around, hanging from a chain. And the bar was about this high and the balls were about down here. And there was 5 of them, and they were touching. And because of the weight of the ball And it's just like the friction on the car. You're eliminating minimizing the effects of the stiffness of the cable and all this kind of stuff. If you took one ball and picked it up and held it out and then let go of it, when it hit the other four, one on the other side would pop out. It would go essentially as far as what you'd held it out. If you pulled two, the one in the middle would stay still and two would go out on the other side. So it was a lot of things that demonstrated the physics and so forth, which fascinated me. Because by this time I had decided I was going to be an engineer, and so that was all of interest. I had originally naturally assumed I'd be a farmer, but when I was about 4, I was out when they were unloading wheat into the wheat bins and found out I had a bad case of asthma to the point that they had to pick me up and carry me into the house. So that pretty well eliminated the farming aspect. So my dad was kind of a natural engineer. He didn't have the degree, but he had the thought process, and he built things, he designed things, he built them, so it was pretty much natural for me to do that. One of the other things that I remember was that they had this, again, a big ball, and this guy was probably this big around. It had a point on the bottom of it, kind of like that, and it was tied to a chain that went up maybe 8 stories. So it was essentially a free-hanging pendulum. I mean, any of the torsion or anything that you might have in that cable was almost zero. Down below it, there was a circle, and it had 24 hours marked off on it. And as the earth moved underneath the ball, it swang back and forth and showed you the time of day. I thought that was pretty cool. They also had an old dentist's office from 1800s. Well, you know, the dentist used to be the barber, and the dentist were one and the same. So it was interesting to look at some of the tools that they had on that. Well, once we got back to Akron, then the boys and their family were picked up in a Chevrolet convertible, police escorts out to the camp. Anything that's, you know, far beyond what I could imagine at that point in time, things that they did to make it very, very special for each of the contestants that came in. And then we spent, I guess it was better part of a week that we spent back there. Probably 4 days, I guess, before the actual day of the race. And do that, they had all kinds of activities going on, and banquets and on all sorts of things. Some of them you can see by looking at some of the memorabilia on here. Oh, another thing they had in the Museum of Science and Industry was a whole section on trains where they had full-size old steam engine kind of things. You know, it's just really an amazing place. One of the things that the soapbox did for me, my dad had always been good at athletics, which I need to tell you something about him to make that significance. He lost his arm, his right arm at the shoulder, when he was 11 years old. He was not handicapped. I don't know anybody that ever worked with him that thought he was handicapped. I'd say he was a farmer. He played baseball and football in high school, and he played baseball as they had town teams back then for the adults, the farmers would get town teams. You say, how did he play baseball? Well, he batted with one hand. He played left field, and so he's got his glove on his left hand. He'd catch the glove, throw it up in the air, take the glove off, catch the ball, and then throw it in. He never played basketball. That was a little too much, you know. But football, again, he played left end. I meant left field for baseball. Sorry about that slip. Played left field, and 20 years ago, he still had the record between he and what was the quarterback at that time for the longest catch ever received in Deuel County High School. So, based on that, his sports thing, and he loved sports, amateur sports. He had no interest in pro sports of any kind. He just thought that was totally wrong. That the amateur sports was his thing. And I was not good in sports. I idolized my dad. I thought I was supposed to be just like him, and I did everything I could, but I had blonde hair, and his hair was dark, and he was good at sports, and I wasn't. And it was not good. You know, my sense of worth, I guess you would say, I sort of tied to the fact, or lack thereof, the fact that I couldn't do what I thought I was supposed to do, which was be good in sports. But when I won the local race in the Soapbox Derby, and although I lost my first race in Akron, still having been to the Nationals, came home, and I remember Dad telling me that one of the jocks from the high school, was good in all the sports. It was a small high school, 100 kids in a 4-year high school. So if you were good in sports, you played all of them. And told Dad, he says, boy, he says, I don't know how Marlin did that. He said, I sure couldn't do that. And I thought, there's something I can do that somebody else can't. And that made really a big turnaround in my life from the Soapbox Derby. So that's kind of a quick summary of it. So if you've got some questions, I'd be happy to answer any of them, if I can. Yes?
Yeah, did it help when your dad gave you that push in the beginning?
When I what?
When your dad gave you a push on it at the beginning?
Yeah. In terms of the starting, which that brings up, in the local race, they had a ramp that would start 2 cars at a time, and there was a bar that would come up and hold, that would catch in the front edge of the nose of the car, and then when that dropped down, then both of the cars started. Then from the ramp, then you went out onto which is just an asphalt road out in the middle between a couple of fields on the southwest side of Sydney. Sydney had a population at that time of about 6,000, and the newspaper said that the people in attendance were about 3,500. So it was a big deal. It was a big deal.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah.
So when you're judging, at the end, judging,
Yeah.
You have women aided down, they talk about all this stuff, but back then, how was it judged? Because it could be really close, I heard, to the cars.
Yeah. It was strictly just 2 people standing on either side of the road watching it with a line painted on the road. And of course the cars are pretty close to the ground, so it's not hard to tell when they cross that painted line.
Did they ever have to have a rerun because it was so close?
No. Mm-mm. Now in Akron, I think they did have cameras set up so that they could look at it.
How far ahead were you where the other car won? When you won?
Oh, when I won, I think I read in the paper that I was maybe 6 seconds or something like that ahead. Yeah. So, yeah. But yeah, for coasting. Now, actually, they got up to pretty good speed. The course was someplace between 1/4 and 1/2 mile, and the end speed, the terminal speed, was somewhere 40 mile an hour. So.
What kind of braking system do you have?
If you could look at the bottom, you would see that there's a board about this long that's hinged about 1/3 of the way of the back from the front. And on the tail end of that board is a piece of rubber tire. There's a pedal in the cockpit which has a cable on it which pulls that down. It moves a stick that pushes it down, and so you have a friction brake against the pavement.
So the brake was against the pavement, not against the tire?
Oh yeah, against the pavement. No, you don't want anything going against the tire.
I think I was told that you wound up being an engineer.
Yes.
Go figure.
Yeah.
Can
Yeah.
you say some of the highlights of your engineering career?
Oh, my engineering career? Well, let's see. Some of the projects I worked on. The Titan ICBM, which was the second ICBM, Atlas being the first. I started with Martin Company in Denver in 1956. And then I worked on the Apollo program. Then after I started my own company, I had some equipment that was used on the SDI, so-called Star Wars program. Some out at Kwajalein Island, some in Texas, some in Colorado Springs. Had some equipment, I guess, back in Long Island, New York. That was another military program. I'm not sure what that was on. But basically, my career consisted of using computers to solve other problems. Like, for instance, another job was a nuclear power plant, controller for a nuclear power plant in Canada. A navigation computer for a Navy airplane. Things like that. Now, when I say a computer, I don't mean like a desktop or a laptop. I mean a chip, okay? So we started at the chip level and built what was necessary around that to do the function that we were trying to control, all these control things. And mostly it was hardware. I did enough programming to check out the things and to some of the routines that were necessary to make a function. So my programming was done at machine language, not higher level language. It was done at machine language. Yeah.
What do you think of private enterprise going into space?
I think it's great. I think anytime you can get private enterprise involved in a project, you're going to get more for your money than you did if you had government do it.
Would
Yeah.
you like to be on the next space line?
Yeah, I would actually. Yeah. I probably couldn't because I don't think my back surgeries would be happy with the thrust. I mean, it's a real kick in the pants when you get off that rocket. Yeah.
Being part of the museum, we were talking about this event coming up, and somebody happened to mention that they restarted the competition. There was somebody, I guess, in Orange County. I don't know.
Yeah, I guess. Now, there were a couple of things that did happen that one of the problems was people like to misread the rules, let's say, and a lot of adults got involved in building cars. Now, when you went back to Akron, one of the things you did was you sat in front of a couple of people that were, and your car was right there, and they would ask you questions about how did you do this, how did you do that, and this was all designed to see whether or not the individual that was going to drive the car actually built it. So one of the things they did in later years, after I built mine, was to say that you couldn't use power tools, and they thought maybe that would keep the adults out of it. It didn't have much effect. But so there was a time when Chevrolet decided they weren't going to sponsor it anymore, and so that was a real hit to the program. And I don't know exactly when it started back up after that. I didn't research that. Yeah.
How many races did you actually race in?
I raced the first race of the day. I was in the middle of 3 cars and I lost.
By an inch. Yes.
Probably more than that. Yeah.
Wearing a weighted suit.
No. Everything had to be functional. Everything had to be functional. Huh?
You can have a big breakfast.
Oh yeah, I could have a big breakfast. Yeah, and about some of the kids, you understand, had to worry about having a big breakfast because they were maybe 120 pounds and the car was 130, and they were right on the nose as to what they could do max. And there was a weigh-in that day. So yeah.
Sure that went on the resume when you went to aerospace.
I don't think it did actually. When I got out of college in '56, there was a big demand for engineers, and you didn't really have to do much of a resume. Just say you had a degree and what your grades were, and that was about it. Yeah. Yeah.
At the Nationals, people were coming from all over the country.
Right.
Then they would have to drive, or they would have to put their car up on a truck, or how would they, everybody have to get to drive?
Most cases they were shipped by rail, and that was once you you won a race in a local race, you lost all contact with the car. They took it in control, the local officials, and it went to a shop where they took off any sponsoring information you'd had at the time and put the local newspaper's name, which you'll see Sydney Telegraph on there. Originally, and the reason it's green, there was an Oliver implement dealer that was my uncle who had sponsored the car originally. Now, sponsoring was not an expensive thing because the wheels and axles cost $14.95, and you were limited to a maximum of $5 over that for all materials. Now, I was fortunate in that all the wood I used was scrap. Didn't cost anything.
You're into recycling at that age.
Oh yeah. When you're raised on a farm, recycling is not a new concept.
The lettering is absolutely fantastic. The lettering, is that original or did you put that?
Did what? That is a decal. Well, no, actually, that may be painted. Yeah, it was painted by someone in town that, in Sydney, by, you know, it was done by the paper, the newspaper hired somebody to do that.
Amazing you kept it all these years.
Well, it has been hanging from upside down from the ceiling of my garage for 20 years, 5 here in Tustin, 15 before that in Fallbrook. Before that, when we were in Villa Park, it spent, well, let's see, I brought it home from Nebraska, brought it here from Nebraska in 1968. So between 68 and 2000, it was in a shed that I had in the Villa Park.
Has Johnny been in there and run that thing yet?
No, I don't think he'd fit in it.
I'm pushing the limit without the car. Marlin, you talked about not having athletic prowess, but you might share that you played in the Orange Bowl in 1955, 1956 with the University of Nebraska.
Well, I didn't play. I played trumpet. Yes, that's true.
Marching band, though.
Yes, and a marching band. Yes, all through high school, and in fact, I started with the high school band when I was in the 4th grade. Like I said, it was a small school, and played the trumpet throughout all that, and then through college. That was an interesting experience, taking the train down from Lincoln to Miami, and then Lincoln, Nebraska. The University of Nebraska was a land grant school, which means that all of the boys, not the girls, all the boys had to take 2 years of ROTC. That you got credit for your PE credits that way. So the uniforms that we had for the band were provided by the ROTC action. Thinking Lincoln, Nebraska, they were heavy wool. We didn't have a different set of the uniforms for the summertime. Miami on New Year's Eve is hotter than in a wool uniform, let me tell you. But that's, yeah.
I remember when we had their first Lincoln Museum with the mayor and my nephew.
Uh-huh.
Your family, I suppose, that they are so proud of you. They are very proud.
Thank you.
It was just bubbling over, so it's very nice that you stepped up to this next Lincoln Museum.
Yeah, well, thank you. Well, as long as we're talking about family, my wife and I have 3 kids, of which Cindy is the first. We have a boy that lives in Anaheim and another boy that lives in Colorado. We have 8 grandkids, of which we have 2 here. And we have 10 great-grandkids, of which we have 3 here. So, huh?
3 grandkids too.
That's what I said, didn't I? Yeah.
Our great
Did what?
engineers in that.
Actually, possibility. Rachel is thinking about engineering. Yeah, right. Yeah. Yes.
I know it's off the subject. Can you talk just a few minutes about nuclear?
The power plant, Pickering.
The power plant?
You said you were.
Yeah. We built the power plant, and this was outside of Ontario, Canada, or Toronto, I'm sorry, Toronto, Canada. And the power plant was built back in the 60s, I'm guessing, yeah, 60s, I think, early 60s. And the control system was designed and built based on an IBM computer, you know, one that filled this room. The software that was running on it was really the most valuable part of the system, because in order to qualify a system, the software in particular, to control a nuclear process, in this case a power plant, it takes millions of dollars worth of hour and time and testing for it to be certified to control a nuclear system. So when the computer got to the point that it can no longer be maintained, IBM didn't have the parts, you know, couldn't get them to do it, then they were looking for a way to replace it. Well, the obvious thing would be to go out and buy a computer this size, hook it up to all the wires, and that'd be relatively cheap. Except you'd have to write all new software, which would be extremely expensive. So what we did, we provided a system that would plug into the slots that attached to the cables of the old system, input and output, that would run the same software that they'd been running all this time, so no requalification on that. It had to do everything right the way it did, and if there's things that the IBM processor did wrong, we had to get the same wrong answer every time. Like, for instance, they stated originally that when you do a division, the remainder is indeterminate. Well, in fact, it wasn't. It had a specific pattern that it followed for each number that pair of numbers you divide. And sometimes the software had used that remainder to generate as a random number or something. So we had to do the same thing. So that's the kind of computer experience that I have is doing that. Now, from the standpoint of the nuclear reactor, we were mostly in the control room, but every time you went from one room to the next, then they wanted to make sure you weren't carrying radiation out of one and into another. So we had what we called the glow test. There was a machine about this high, and you'd step up on it, and that would check your feet, and you'd put your hands in it, and that would check your hands, and as long as they didn't glow, then you were all right to go to the next place. Now, when you left the facility at night, then they had a full body scan that went over. And we also wore dosimeters that gave you the total dose while you were there, and if you were coming back, they kept that one with your name on it, and you came back again, you got the same one. So it was the total dose that you had accumulated during all the time you'd been there. The plants in Canada are different than the nuclear plants here. Mostly in the area, the way they cool the core, and also in the emergency aspect of what they do if there is an overheat and overrun. Obviously, they are all used. The nuclear plant is a means to generate heat, and that heat then is used to boil water, and the steam drives a turbine, just like a conventional oil-fired or coal-fired plant would do. One of the people that I worked with was a former Navy nuclear submarine. He was an officer on a nuclear submarine. And when he went into that facility, it scared the devil out of him. He says, I can't believe that their controls are as loose, because what he'd seen on the submarine was significantly more. But
I understand you had a really tough negotiator for that contract.
yeah, my daughter worked for the same company, and she was the project manager on that project, of which I was the lead engineer. And also, our second son would also work for the same company, and he was into manufacturing. So,
I heard radiation curler.
yeah, actually, yeah. And there's some other things too, but I won't tell you what they are. Yeah, Joe.
What do you think of artificial intelligence?
Well, you know, it's better. It's better than some of what we get naturally.
Perfect answer.
No, I think, you know, artificial intelligence, just like a lot of technical developments, can be used for a lot of good things, and it can be used for a lot of bad things. I remember when computers first came out, and you looked at what some of the things that people did with computers, and the statement was, computers are really good at doing a lot of things that never ever needed to be done. So, you know, it's the same thing's true of artificial intelligence. It can be used for some nasty things. So, you know, like we need to control it. We still have to have some ethics.
What was the technology available when you were working on the Apollo project?
Apollo project was the Apollo project where integrated circuits were first developed, because it would have been impossible to complete that project without the capability of an integrated circuit. Now, at that time, an integrated circuit was about 1 inch long and 3/10 of an inch wide, and it had 16 legs on it. And the complexity of the circuits inside was 2 + 2 = 4. That's about it. I mean, it couldn't actually add, but I mean, you could make a logic decision. So you have two inputs, and if they're both true, the output's true. If either one's false, the output's false. You could have 4 circuits like that. And that was the extent of an integrated circuit. And this was amazing over what you had to do with individual resistors, capacitors, diodes, and transistors.
Was TI doing those? TI?
TI was one of many. Yeah, TI was early in the game. Yeah. Yeah. When I worked on the Apollo program, if you took all of the computers that were used in the design, in the launch system at Houston, in all of the companies that made the engines for it, and all of that, and took all those computers and put them together, their total power was significantly less than what I have in my pocket. Significantly less. And the amount of memory that I have here, way more than existed in the world at that time. Probably even counting magnetic tape.
I was real lucky. I was involved back in the beginning when the this for everybody to come out with better shape.
Yeah. Well, the technology has gone from a feature size, the traces that were, you know, physically visible, to now they're talking about 2 nanometers. They're talking about it so small that integrated circuits used to run on 5 volts. Most of them, some at 15, but most of them 5 volts. They got so small that the electrons would jump from one trace to the other, so they had to go down to, most of them now are running on 1 volt. You know, yeah.
Any more questions? I, for one, enjoyed that whole program. Thank you, Marlin.
Yeah.
Did anybody not enjoy that? Good. Nobody can incriminate themselves. Just two quick things. One, we have some water, there's some wine, there's some brownies up there, compliments of American grub. Please eat them, because if you don't, I will, and I don't need to eat them. The other thing is a reminder, if you're not a member and you would like to be a member, we have a benefactor that's going to pay your membership, so no reason not to do it, because there's a lot of great benefits to being a member and supporting the Historical Society. So I want to thank everybody for coming. Thank you, Marlin. Thank you to the Johnson family for all the hard work getting this ready. So, couldn't do it alone. So, all right, thank you.